Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, of course, the Brexit negotiations are still ongoing, and that means we all have to try and get to grip with the language of trade deals. On Thursday, MPs debated whether to stay in the EU's customs union. The government, of course, has said that we will not. So, what's at stake? Our reporter, Elizabeth Glinka, is here. Can you explain to us what the stakes are?
I can try. Now, of course, at the moment, the EU is made up of 28 individual nations, and those 28 nations are also part of the customs union. So goods can move around freely, and to all intents and purposes, the bloc behaves for trade as if it is one country. And that applies when trading with the rest of the world as well, because all the countries in the bloc set duties, taxes at exactly the same level. When we leave the European Union, we could stay in the customs union, but as you've said, the government are very intent that we do leave the customs union.
So what then are the other options?
Well, that's where things become complicated, because of course at that point the borders, the customs borders, come back into play. Now that raises issues for trade more broadly for our businesses, but particularly raises issues around that Northern Ireland border, because of course not having a border there is part of the Good Friday Agreement. So the government has to kind of try and square this circle to allow goods to move as freely as possible and protect that border. To do that, they have come up with two possible alternatives. The first is the much vaunted customs agreement, and the second one is maximum facilitation, which sounds like it's a sci-fi film, but does indeed involve a lot of technology. Now, both of these ideas have their critics. We understand that even within Cabinet there are huge differences of opinion about which one the government should go for, although Sunday Politics has learnt this week that on Wednesday that subcommittee, the inner Cabinet for Brexit, is actually going to be deciding which option to go for, which could lead to some interesting consequences. In the meantime, we have been into the department for exiting the European Union and had a chat to the Minister Steve Baker about those two options.
Let's have a look.
Time and time again, we have been told we are leaving the customs union. But what does that actually mean in practice? Well, pretty soon the people in there are going to be having to make a decision. But in the meantime, a lot of the real work is happening down there at number 9. And that's where we're going now. Come on.
Good morning, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Welcome to Dexu.
Thank you very
for coming.
much. Nice to see
After
you. Very good. Look at this.
Well, it turns out ministers need a range of skills these days.
Were you good at art at school?
No.
So, if we leave the customs union, what are the other options?
The government has put forward two credible options. The first we're calling the new customs partnership. The idea here is that the UK would charge the EU's common external tariff to the rest of the world. So that if a car came into the UK but went on to France to be sold, we'd simply charge the EU's external tariff. If we decided, though, to lower the tariffs on cars, and a car came into the UK and was sold here, what would happen is the importer would be able to reclaim the difference between the EU's tariff and our tariff.
Okay, so we would have to be sending some money for the duties, for the taxes for goods being sold into Europe. We would be having to collect that and send that to Brussels.
So the way it would work is that the UK would collect the common external tariff for the EU, yes.
But how would this work in practice? Does this require a lot of new technology?
Obviously it would require some coordination in the UK to make it work, but we are confident that this is a credible, if new, solution to this particular issue.
See, you're confident it's credible, but there are critics of this scheme, both Brexiteers and Remainers, who say it's just not going to work.
But we believe that this is a credible solution to go forwards, which allows us to ensure there are no new customs checks with the EU.
Could it mean that we end up staying in the customs union for longer while those arrangements, while that technology comes forward?
So you'll know that during the implementation period, we will operate as if in a customs union with the European Union, so that there are no practical changes up to December 20. But beyond that, we will leave the customs union. That is the government's policy.
That's a guarantee.
It is the government's policy that the implementation period is time limited, and we will leave the customs union in December 20.
So no running on?
We'll have no facility to extend the implementation period.
Okay, right, so let's talk about option 2. What does that look like?
So with the second option, which we're calling the highly streamlined facility, what we would do...
Or max FAC?
It's maximum facilitation. So what we do is we have the opportunity to run the UK's own tariffs as we face the rest of the world. So for rest of the world trade, there's no change from today. And we'd agree with the European Union a range of facilitations on trade to minimise friction. So for example, we'd have trusted trader mutual recognition. We already have trusted traders, but we agree with the European Union that some companies can be relied upon to do their paperwork accurately away from the border. We'd use technology like advanced notification so that we know what's going to and fro with paperwork done again away from the border. And that would allow us to minimise the customs checks between the UK and the rest of the EU.
But this would mean actual borders, wouldn't it? So does that throw up particular problems for the Northern Ireland border?
Of course, around the border there is already a currency border, there is already an excise duty border, there is already a tax border. So these are issues which are not new. We would agree with the European Union a number of things like trusted traders, which would deal with the really significant trade, and then waivers for individuals and for small traders so that they didn't have to do customs declarations. And what we're saying is that with those facilitations on the island of Ireland, we can have no new infrastructure on the border.
No new infrastructure.
That is what we're committed to.
So those are the options. Now all they've got to do is agree on one of them and convince Parliament and the EU that they're workable.
That shouldn't be hard. Well, we're joined now by the Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Jo Swinson and the Conservative MP and Brexiteer Bernard Jenkin. Welcome to both of you. So as Elizabeth said, we just got to pick an option, then convince Parliament, and then convince the EU. Do you have a preferred option?
I'm not particularly impressed by this new customs partnership at all. I don't think it resolves anything. And indeed, staying in the customs union doesn't necessarily mean you get rid of border checks, because all these, the EU is insisting if we don't want border checks, then we've got to align our regulation with the EU. It's a very extreme position. All over the world, countries are pursuing what is called the max FAC solution. All over the world, the countries are developing a frictionless customs frontier, and that's what we should be working towards in Northern Ireland.
So you don't believe the customs partnership idea could work?
No. I mean, it doesn't pass any of the key tests that the Prime Minister has already sort of outlined in her statements. It doesn't give us full regulatory autonomy, so we wouldn't be able to do free trade deals with other countries. Even if we did a free trade deal with another country, it would be very unattractive, because we would be asking them to eliminate their tariffs, but we would still be charging the EU tariff when the goods came into this country. And we would still be substantial net contributors to the European Union budget, which, as the Prime Minister has said, should end. We would still be the tax collector for the European Union, and that's not acceptable.
So, Jo Swinson, does the first idea that Steve Baker was discussing there, a customs partnership, which sounds closer to staying in the customs union, which would be your preferred option, but the Prime Minister has absolutely ruled it out. Do you prefer it because it keeps us closer to the EU?
I mean, I think the I mean, the government is in a mess on this. They are sort of, it seems, belatedly starting to recognise the ludicrousness of these red lines, which never needed to be set out in the way that the Prime Minister put them there, the problems that they are creating for the border in Northern Ireland particularly, but also for the many businesses in the UK. You know, most of our export trade, you know, is with the EU. Nearly half of all of it is with the EU, far dwarfing other countries and blocs around the world, and that is what is at risk. And of course, the more that you have barriers, the more that you have regulatory differences, the more risk there will be to that vitally important trade for the British economy.
But what answer do you have to that other than staying in the customs union, which the Prime Minister has ruled out and the government has said it's what you have to leave the customs union to respect the result of the referendum?
Well, I would say the government's wrong on that, and I think actually if you look at Parliament, there's going to be an interesting vote on this within a few weeks in the House of Commons. I suspect actually in Parliament, in the House of Commons, there may actually be a majority for staying in the customs union. So just because the government has said it, it doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to get them to change their minds, because staying in the customs union is absolutely a better option. We should be staying in the customs union and the single market. I think we should be staying in the European Union. But at least staying in the customs union and the single market minimises the damage from Brexit, although even the government's own assessment says that the economy will take a hit even if that softer option is pursued.
I mean, well, at least you're honest about the fact that you would much rather stay in the EU, and that's why you want to stay in the customs union. But that is just trying to thwart Brexit, isn't it? Because you're against it.
Well, I want to do what's best for the country. You know, I was elected by people in Eastern Bartonshire, incidentally, who also voted very strongly to stay in the European Union, as did people across Scotland. You know, 62% across Scotland voted for that outcome. And so I'm trying to make that happen, because I also recognise that for our influence in the world, for our economic health, for all of the values and the benefits the European Union has brought us, it makes more sense. And what we are now seeing as this government negotiates a catastrophic Brexit, I mean, it's not even doing the negotiations competently. The Cabinet can't even agree on what it wants, and we're nearly 2 years on from that initial vote. So, you know, I think as people look at the shenanigans of this government, then more and more people will say, well, hang on, we want to be able to have a say when this deal is done.
Bernard Jenkins, your problem is that the arithmetic in the House of Commons might agree with Jo Swinson's point on this and not you, and vote to stay in the customs union.
Well, they might, but that would be a pretty unwise thing to do. That would be pitting Parliament against the choice made by the British people. And these red lines didn't come from nowhere. These red lines came out of the referendum result, which was about taking back control.
How did they come out of the referendum result?
Exactly, taking back control over our money, our borders, our laws, and the right to make free trade deals with other countries. If we do any of these solutions that are proposed by the Liberal Democrats, we might as well stay in the European Union, because we will have to finish up obeying the rules of the European Court of Justice. Now, we can have the whole referendum debate again. I don't think the British people want that. They want I think the British people want to leave the European Union. And you know what? Most countries aren't in the European Union. Most countries aren't in any kind of customs arrangement with the EU or with any other country, and they export to lots of other countries very efficiently. This is not an economic argument, it's a political argument. It's not about whether... Everybody agrees that we can prosper outside the European Union. This is a political argument that they have lost, and they will not admit that they have lost.
On trade, the European Union has more trade deals with more countries than the US or China. It is a very successful negotiating bloc for promoting trade and therefore helping economies. But we shouldn't... I agree, we shouldn't have the same... I agree, we shouldn't have the same debate again. What we should have is a debate where we actually look at what is on offer. Now, the government is doing its negotiations, which is not the same as what was talked about last time we had this. We had the debate in 2016, because we now have a lot more information and more detail.
This is trying to reverse Brexit.
Well,
this is trying to stop Brexit, and Joe's very honest about that, and I would perfectly respect your view, Joe.
But it should be the people that have their say on the deal.
No, you want a second referendum?
No, I want a vote on the deal. I want that not to be just signed off by Parliament.
It is the Liberal policy to have a second referendum, and I think the fact is people want...
But Bernard Jenkins, let me ask you, the Brexit subcommittee of the Cabinet will meet this week, and they're going to decide between the options that Steve Baker was explaining to us there. There is some speculation that they'll go for the customs partnership idea that you've already dismissed. What will happen within the Tory party if that's the way the Cabinet...
Well, I knew you'd ask me that question, but I don't think they're going to go for this. I think the Prime Minister will realise that she can't deliver what the British people... She feels very, very strongly that she must keep faith with the decision of the British people.
And
I think
is that because of the threat coming from the European Reform Group and MPs like you who are whispering behind the scenes that they might trigger a leadership contest if she goes for a decision you don't like?
The people who have been threatening the Prime Minister are the Remainers in the Conservative Party. They're the people that voted against the government and are threatening to bring the government down. But actually, I think they will be defeated in a vote. And don't forget the Ulster Unionists. They also want to keep faith with the British people. And we mustn't lose their support. That would be very bad for the government. In the end, the Prime Minister wants to keep faith with the British people, which means being like most other countries, running our own regulations, running our own laws, and none of these proposals that the Liberal Democrats are proposing would put us back in control of our own laws, and that's what really matters.
You say it's the Remainers in the Conservative Party who are threatening the Prime Minister. Amber Rudd was at the lobby journalist lunch this week, and she didn't say in absolute terms we'll be leaving the customs union. She said there were still discussions to be had about this in Cabinet. Is she right about that? And are you worried that these discussions are still open in Cabinet?
She made it absolutely clear in a subsequent statement that we're leaving the customs union. I mean, the only argument I might have with her...
It's quite a state of affairs when she has to tweet several hours later what she meant when she was discussing something that the Prime Minister has been so clear on, that we'll be leaving the customs union. Well,
she made her view completely clear, just as Steve Baker, just on your programme, was probably explaining the government line, though he probably agrees with me in private that we shouldn't do this new customs partnership. Collective responsibility is very important in government, and that's why Amber Rudd put out a subsequent tweet. And of course, it's not the only thing Amber Rudd's had to tweet about and correct the record on this week. As this debate continues to go on as to whether or not she knew about the removal targets for illegal immigrants and who'd seen what memo and whether targets have been set within the department. Are you absolutely convinced that she's up to the job? Yes, absolutely. I mean, she's a first-rate Home Secretary. I mean, we know that since the days of the last Labour government, the Home Office has had a huge number of challenges, and because the borders were thrown open under the last Labour government and there was a huge increase in immigration, and we've got a huge number of people in this country illegally on expired visas. This is a very big problem. I think in the end the government's going to have to throw much more resource at this, as Andrew Green from Migration Watch says, for example, in order to deal with this problem. And I think the pressure on officials to try and achieve government policy has been very intense. Right. They may have been setting themselves targets. That's obviously, it's not right that targets we'll have to leave it there. Should be more important than judgment and compassion in these cases, and that's what we've learned. Joe Swinson, thank you very much for that. In a moment, I'll be speaking to the panel, Gabby Hinsliff, Ian Dale and Rachel Shabby. But first, Theresa May well be relying on the votes of Democratic Unionist MPs to get her Brexit deal through Parliament. So let's talk to the party's leader in Westminster, Nigel Dodds, who joins us now from Banbridge. Thank you very much for talking to us today. As I'm sure you're very well aware, the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, is coming to your part of the world tomorrow. He'll be on the Irish border with the Irish Taoiseach and the Taoiseach. Have you been invited along?
Well, I think our party representatives have been invited. We have met Michel Barnier in Brussels. We communicate with him regularly, and we have made clear what our position is. He's in no doubt whatsoever about Northern Ireland's position as far as the DUP is concerned. And of course, our position is negotiated through the United Kingdom government, and we will be in discussions again tomorrow and during the rest of the week with our own government about the EU Brexit deal.
And your position is you're very, very clear that there can be no border across the Irish Sea. So you can't have Northern Ireland staying in any kind of regulatory alignment with the EU whilst the rest of the UK differs. Do you think that some of the proposed solutions for future trading with the EU after Brexit, like the idea of a customs partnership, that they solve the border issue sufficiently and that the EU will accept that?
Well, there's two different questions there. I think that the EU are in the position at the minute, along with the Irish government, of seeking to force the government's hand and try to bring pressure, even bullying, in terms of what they would like to see as the outcome, which is the UK as a whole to stay inside the customs union and the single market. The fact of the matter is that we will judge any proposals as far as the customs union is concerned against the criteria of whether or not it allows the UK to have as frictionless trade as possible with the rest of the EU, allows us to do trade deals with the rest of the world, ensures that there is the economic integrity of the United Kingdom, and which basically ensures that we deliver on the verdict of the people in the referendum. But you're right to point out that at the minute, what is of concern to the DUP would be any suggestion that Northern Ireland would be hived off into any kind of special arrangement, which would be economically catastrophic for everyone in Northern Ireland, Remainer and Brexiteer alike.
Now, you say that you feel the EU is trying to bully the UK into staying in the customs union because they say there would need to be full alignment for the border to work in Ireland. But it's your absolute insistence that there's no divergence between the UK and the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland that's creating the situation where the UK has to even consider staying in the customs union. If you were simply prepared to allow there to be a little bit of divergence between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, then the EU wouldn't be able to try and bully the UK into staying in the customs union. No.
I think that's a rather perverse reading of the situation. I haven't even heard the most ardent pro-Remainers in the House of Commons advance that particular argument. The reality is that even Keir Starmer, the Labour spokesman, said that no British government could possibly deliver on the kind of arrangement that the EU is seeking to put into legal language as far as the backstop arrangement. Of course, we're prepared to consider pragmatic, sensible areas of cooperation like the single electricity market, like animal health products on an all-Ireland basis. That is the current position. But no British government, never mind the Unionists of Northern Ireland, could possibly tolerate a situation where when you have 60% of the trade of Northern Ireland, all our sales go into the UK market, more than the rest of the world, the EU and the Irish Republic put together, that you would have this border down the Irish Sea, which not only would be constitutionally breaking up the United Kingdom at the behest of the EU, but would also economically be catastrophic, because as the years will go by, our economy would diverge more and more from our main sales market.
Okay,
anyone with any common sense realises that's a disaster, and that's a position that we have common with the rest of the Tory party.
In order to avoid there being a border down the Irish Sea, which you say is your absolute red line, could you therefore live with the whole of the UK staying in the customs union? So there's no divergence between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, but we're all still in the customs union.
Well, that is a wider argument about the future of the UK as a whole, and we're prepared and happy to engage in that argument on the basis of the UK as a whole. Our position on that is that we don't believe that staying in the customs union is something that delivers on the verdict of the British people, because it means that we, as a country, are rule takers from Brussels, that we have to abide by the rules set by others.
But you could live with it?
We have no input into that. It means that our markets, let me finish, our markets would be accessed by others under trade deals which would be negotiated by the EU, and we wouldn't have any say in that, and wouldn't leave us free to negotiate the trade deals across the rest of the world. So we have a view on that, but our main concern is to ensure that whatever happens, the United Kingdom, the whole of it, moves in lockstep together as we leave the European Union.
So it sounds like you're saying you don't like the customs union, but as long as Northern Ireland and the UK are in lockstep, you could live with staying in the customs union.
Well, we're already in this customs union, the single market and the European Union, and Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, so we will go, just as the referendum result. Northern Ireland voted as a region, differently from the overall result, but the overall result is what's matter, and the overall arrangements are what is crucial.
All right, well, Nigel Dodds, thank you very much for talking to us today. So we'll come back to our panel and pick up on some of this arrangements for future trade after Brexit. The subcommittee of the Cabinet will meet on Wednesday. We understand they will finally take a decision as to what they would like those trading arrangements to look like. Of course, that doesn't mean the EU will necessarily agree to them. I mean, Ian, do you have a sense of where they're likely to go? We saw the options earlier, customs partnership or maximum facilitation, max FAC. What do you think they're likely to choose?
This is an absolutely crucial meeting, and I don't really understand why they're having it the day before the local elections, because whatever headlines come out of it, they're going to be pretty big. I can't see how that committee can support this so-called customs partnership. The Prime Minister seems to be dead set on that. Ollie Robbins, the chief civil service negotiator, seems to have convinced her of this. Which is not a surprise. 90% of the civil service voted Remain, and a lot of people see this customs partnership as a way of staying in the customs union in a quasi way, and then when a new government comes in, they could automatically go back into it. I think it's real dangers in going down that path. Whether there will be, if she does insist on this, I think that's going to be a crucial moment for the Prime Minister, because there will be lots of people on the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party who will just not tolerate this, because they will see it as staying within the European Union in a way, and they would be right on that, it has to be said. So whether there will be resignations, if that's the case, who knows? I certainly wouldn't rule it out, and that there were probably 4 or 5 candidates for that. And if that happened, the Prime Minister's position then becomes very shaky, because you might well get a lot of Tory MPs putting in letters to Graham Brady. So there are lots of consequences will come from this meeting on Wednesday.
Well, and this threat to the Prime Minister's position has been around in the ether for a couple of weeks. People saying, oh, well, the Chief Whip already has a lot of letters. It wouldn't take very many more for her to trigger a leadership contest. She has to be careful not to upset the Brexiteers. But then we heard Bernard Jenkin earlier saying, actually, it's the Remainers who are keeping her prisoner. It's difficult for the Prime Minister to go, which route contains less danger for her?
Pretty much everyone is trying to keep her prisoner at the moment. You know, Brexiters, Remainers within the party, you know, the DUP, the EU itself. She's trying to please so many different constituencies. In numerical terms, the biggest threat is from Brexiters. There are more hard-right Tories who would be furious at any sort of betrayal than there are probably Tory Remainers. So that's where the big numerical threat from. But I think even if she could get the idea of a customs partnership past this meeting, suppose she was prepared to accept a few cabinet resignations, suppose she wouldn't be too sorry if Boris Johnson chose this moment to flounce out or whatever, even then, there's no sign that necessarily the EU thinks this is a workable
Well, they've already
compromise.
rejected it, haven't
So
they?
it could merely end up being a delaying tactic that buys us time before we come to this sort of collision with reality all over again. The amazing thing is, for ages, people thought the customs union was the easy bit. I mean, the difficult arguments were supposed to be around immigration, freedom of movement, the single market. We haven't got on to any of that yet. Customs union was meant to be this small technical difficulty that we'd find our way out of.
There's also...
And just let me bring in Rachel, and there isn't a huge amount of time left to get all of this signed off before we're actually leaving the European Union. There's a suspicion among some people that these delaying tactics mean that there won't be time in order to arrange a deal properly.
I think the huge frustration with this entire conversation is that you know, it's leavers who have a very puritanical, quite tyrannically puritanical version of what Brexit should mean.
should mean Brexit.
Hang on, imposing their terms on a population. Now, I don't think that's where people who voted to leave are at. It's certainly not where the country at large is at. It's not where government is, it's not where Parliament is at, it's not where the Lords is at, it's not where the EU is at, and it's not where Northern Ireland is at, or Ireland, the island of Ireland is at. So given all these things, surely it is just a matter of time before this purity version of Brexit comes to face with a harsh reality, the light of harsh reality, and says, this is not feasible. We have to stay in some kind of customs union in order to proceed to the next bits of Brexit that we urgently need to discuss before we leave.
It's not being puritanical to say that if you leave the European Union, you have to leave the customs union. That's what we were told in the campaign. It was in that booklet that was sent to every single house. It was in the Tory manifesto. No. It was in the Tory manifesto. So are you suggesting the government should go back on the Tory party manifesto?
We are leaving. We just can't leave in the way that the Brexit people, the people who led Brexit, want us to leave.
Well, I think we
can't do that.
But there is another shadow on the horizon here, and this is in Amber Rudd's purview, so it might be a problem for her, because at this meeting I'm also told that they're talking about a proposal from the Home Office to have some sort of labour agreement with the EU. Now, that really would be a red rag to the bull, because we've constantly heard from all the government that, well, everybody should be on the same level in terms of coming to this country after Brexit, entirely reasonably. If we give preference to EU citizens after Brexit, again, that's partially staying in the EU.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming in. I'm sure we will be talking about this next week and for many weeks to come.